Chapter 10. The Further Adventures of Toad. The front door of the hollow tree faced eastwards, so Toad was called at an early hour, partly by the bright sunlight streaming in on him, partly by the exceeding coldness of his toes, which made him dream that he was at home in bed in his own handsome room with a Tudor window on a cold winter's night, and his bedclothes had got up, grumbling and protesting they couldn't stand the cold any longer, and had run downstairs to the kitchen fire to warm themselves. And he had followed on bare feet along miles and miles of icy, stone-paved passages, arguing and beseeching them to be reasonable. He would probably have been aroused much earlier had he not slept for some weeks on straw over stone flags and almost forgotten the friendly feeling of thick blankets pulled well up around the chin. Sitting up, he rubbed his eyes first and his complaining toes next, wondered for a moment where he was, looking around for a familiar stone wall and a little barred window, then with a leap of the heart remembered everything. His escape, his flight, his pursuit. Remembered first and best thing of all, that he was free. Free. The word and thought alone were worth 50 blankets. He was warm from end to end as he thought of the jolly world outside, waiting eagerly for him to make his triumphal entrance, ready to serve him and play up to him, anxious to help him and keep him company, as it always had been in days of old before misfortune fell upon him. He shook himself and combed the dry leaves out of his hair with his fingers, and his toilet complete, marched forth into the comfortable morning sun, cold but confident, hungry but hopeful, all nervous terrors of yesterday dispelled by rest and sleep and frank and heartening sunshine. He had the world all to himself that early summer morning. The dewy woodland, as he threaded it, was solitary and still. The green fields that succeeded the trees were his own to do as he liked with. The road itself, when he reached it, in that loneliness that was everywhere, seemed, like a stray dog, to be looking anxiously for company. Toad, however, was looking for something that could talk and tell him clearly which way he ought to go. It is all very well when you have a light heart and a clear conscience and money in your pocket, and nobody scouring the country for you to drag you off to prison again, to follow where the road beckons and points, not caring whither. The practical Toad cared very much indeed, and he could have kicked the road for its helpless silence when every minute was of importance to him. The reserved rustic road was presently joined by a shy little brother in the shape of a canal, which took its hand and ambled along by its side in perfect confidence, but with the same tongue-tied, uncommunicative attitude toward strangers. "Bother 'em," said Toad to himself. "But anyhow, one thing's clear. They must be coming from somewhere and going to somewhere. You can't get over that, Toad, my boy." So he marched on patiently by the water's edge. Round a bend in the canal came plodding a solitary horse, stooping forward as if in anxious thought. From rope traces attached to his collar stretched a long line, taut but dipping with his stride, the furthest part of it dripping pearly drops. Toad let the horse pass, and stood waiting for what the fates were sending him. With a pleasant swirl of quiet water at its blunt bow, the barge slid up alongside him, its gaily painted gunwale level with the towing path, its sole occupant, a big, stout woman wearing a linen sunbonnet, one brawny arm laid along the tiller. "A nice morning, ma'am," she remarked to Toad as she drew up level with him. "I dare say it is, ma'am," responded Toad politely as he walked along the tow-path abreast of her. "I dare say it is a nice morning to them that's not in sore trouble, like what I am. Here's my married daughter. She sends off to me post-haste to come to her at once, so off I goes, not knowing what may be happening or going to happen, but fearing the worst, as you'll understand, ma'am, if you're a mother too. And I've left my business to look after itself. I'm in a washing and laundering line, you must know, ma'am. And I've left my young children to look after themselves, and a more mischievous and troublesome bunch of imps doesn't exist, ma'am. And I've lost all my money and lost my way, and as for what may be happening to my married daughter, why, I don't like to think of it, ma'am." "Where might your married daughter be living, ma'am?" asked the barge woman. "She lives near the river, ma'am," replied Toad, "close to a fine house called Toad Hall that's somewheres hereabouts in these parts. Maybe you've heard of it." "Toad Hall? Why, I'm going that way myself," replied the barge woman. "This canal joins the river some miles further on, a little above Toad Hall, and then it's an easy walk. You come along in the barge with me, and I'll give you a lift." She steered the barge close to the bank, and Toad, with many humble and grateful acknowledgments, stepped lightly on board and sat down with great satisfaction. "Toad's luck again," thought he. "I always come out on top." "So you're in the washing business, ma'am," said the barge woman politely as they glided along. "And a very good business you've got, too, I dare say, if I'm not making too free in saying so." "Finest business in the whole country," said Toad airily. "All the gentry come to me. Wouldn't go anywhere else if they were paid. They know me so well. You see, I understand my work thoroughly and attend to it all by myself. Washing, ironing, clear starching, making up gents' fine shirts for evening wear, everything done under my own eye." "But surely you don't do all that work yourself, ma'am?" asked the barge woman respectfully. "Oh, I have girls," said the Toad lightly. 20 girls or thereabouts, always at work. But you know what girls are, ma'am. Nasty little hussies, that's what I call them." "So do I," said the barge woman with great heartiness. "But I dare say you set yours to rights, the idle trollops. And are you very fond of washing?" "I love it," said Toad. "I simply dote on it. Never so happy as when I got both arms in the washtub. But then it comes so easy to me. No trouble at all. A real pleasure, I assure you, ma'am." "What a bit of luck meeting you," observed the barge woman thoughtfully. "A regular piece of good fortune for both of us." "Why, what do you mean?" asked Toad nervously. "Well, look at me now," replied the barge woman. "I like washing too, just same as you do, and for that matter, whether I like it or not, I have got to do all my own, naturally moving about as I do. Now my husband, he's such a fellow for shirking his work and leaving the barge to me that never a moment do I get for seeing to my own affairs. By rights he ought to be here now, either steering or attending to the horse, though luckily the horse has sense enough to attend to himself. Instead of which he's gone off with the dog to see if they can't pick up a rabbit for dinner somewhere, says he'll catch me at the next lock. Well, that's as it may be. I don't trust him once he gets off with that dog, who's worse than he is. But meantime, how am I to get on with my washing?" "Oh, never mind about the washing," said Toad, not liking the subject. "Try and fix your mind on that rabbit. A nice, fat, young rabbit, I'll be bound. Got any onions?" "Well, I can't fix my mind on anything but my washing," said the barge woman, "and I wonder you can be talking of rabbits with such a joyful prospect before you. There's a heap of things of mine that you'll find in the corner of the cabin. If you'll take just one or two of the most necessary sort, I won't venture to describe them to a lady like you, but you'll recognize them at a glance and put them through the wash tub as we go along. Why, it'll be a pleasure to you, as you rightly say, and a real help to me. You'll find a tub handy and soap and a kettle on the stove and a bucket to haul up water from the canal with. Then I shall know you're enjoying yourself instead of sitting here idle looking at the scenery and yawning your head off." "Here, you let me steer," said the Toad, now thoroughly frightened, "and then you can get on to your washing your own way. I might spoil your things or not do 'em as you like. I'm more used to gentlemen's things myself. It's my special line." "Let you steer?" replied the barge woman, laughing. "It takes some practice to steer a barge properly. Besides, it's dull work, and I want you to be happy. No, you shall do the washing you're so fond of, and I'll stick to the steering that I understand. Don't try and deprive me of the pleasure of giving you a treat." Toad was fairly cornered. He looked for escape this way and that, saw that he was too far from the bank for a flying leap, and sullenly resigned himself to his fate. "If it comes to that," he thought in desperation, "I suppose any fool can wash." He fetched the tub, soap, and other necessaries from the cabin, selected a few garments at random, tried to recollect what he had seen in casual glances through laundry windows, and set to. A long half-hour passed, and every minute of it saw Toad getting crosser and crosser. Nothing that he could do to the things seemed to please them or do them good. He tried coaxing, he tried slapping, he tried punching. They smiled back at him out of the tub, unconverted, happy in their original sin. Once or twice he looked nervously over his shoulder at the barge woman, but she appeared to be gazing out in front of her, absorbed in her steering. His back ached badly, and he noticed with dismay that his paws were beginning to get all crinkly. Now Toad was very proud of his paws. He muttered under his breath words that should never pass the lips of either washerwoman or toads, and lost the soap for the 50th time. A burst of laughter made him straighten himself and look around. The barge woman was leaning back and laughing unrestrainedly till tears ran down her cheeks. "I've been watching you the whole time," she gasped. "I thought you must be a humbug all along from the conceited way you talked. Pretty washerwoman you are. Never washed so much as a dishcloth in your life, I'll lay." Toad's temper, which had been simmering viciously for some time, now fairly boiled over, and he lost all control of himself. "You common, low, fat barge woman," he shouted. "Don't you dare talk to your betters like that. Washerwoman indeed. I would have you know that I am Toad, a very well-known, respected, dignified, distinguished Toad. I may be under a bit of a cloud at present, but I will not be laughed at by a barge woman." The woman moved nearer to him and peered under his bonnet keenly and closely. "Why, so you are," she cried. "Well, I never. A horrid, nasty, crawly Toad, and in my nice, clean barge, too. Now that's a thing I will not have." She relinquished the tiller for a moment. One big mottled arm shot out and caught Toad by a foreleg, while the other gripped him fast by a hind leg. The world turned suddenly upside down. The barge seemed to flit lightly across the sky. The wind whistled in his ears, and Toad found himself flying through the air, revolving rapidly as he went. The water, when he eventually reached it with a loud splash, proved quite cold enough for his taste, though its chill was not sufficient to quell his proud spirit or slake the heat of his furious temper. He rose to the surface, spluttering, and when he had wiped the duckweed out of his eyes, the first thing he saw was the fat barge woman looking back at him over the stern of the retreating barge and laughing. And he vowed, as he coughed and choked, to be even with her. He struck out for the shore, but the cotton gown greatly impeded his efforts, and when at length he touched land, he found it hard to climb up the steep bank unassisted. He had to take a minute or two's rest to recover his breath. Then, gathering his wet skirts well over his arms, he started to run after the barge as fast as his legs would carry him, wild with indignation, thirsting for revenge. The barge woman was still laughing when he drew up level with her. "Put yourself through your mangle, washerwoman," she called out, "and iron your face and crimp it, and you'll pass for quite a decent-looking Toad." Toad never paused to reply. Solid revenge was what he wanted, not cheap, windy, verbal triumphs, though he had a thing or two in his mind that he would have liked to say. He saw what he wanted ahead of him. Running swiftly on, he overtook the horse, unfastened the tow rope, and cast off, jumped lightly on the horse's back, and urged it to a gallop by kicking it vigorously in the sides. He steered for the open country, abandoning the towpath, and swinging his steed down a rutty lane. Once he looked back and saw the barge had run aground on the other side of the canal, and the barge woman was gesticulating wildly and shouting, "Stop, stop, stop!" "I've heard that song before," said Toad, laughing as he continued to spur his steed onward in its wild career. The barge horse was not capable of any very sustained effort, and its gallop soon subsided into a trot, and its trot into an easy walk. But Toad was quite contented with this, knowing that he, at any rate, was moving, and the barge was not. He had quite recovered his temper now that he had done something he thought really clever, and he was satisfied to jog along quietly in the sun, steering his horse along byways and bridle paths, and trying to forget how very long it was since he had had a square meal, till the canal had been left very far behind him. He had traveled some miles, his horse and he was feeling drowsy in the hot sunshine when the horse stopped, lowered his head, and began to nibble the grass. And Toad, waking up, just saved himself from falling off by an effort. He looked about him and found he was on a wide common, dotted with patches of gorse and bramble as far as he could see. Near him stood a dingy gypsy caravan, and beside it a man was sitting on a bucket turned upside down, very busy smoking and staring into the wild world. A fire of sticks was burning nearby, and over the fire hung an iron pot, and out of that pot came forth bubblings and gurglings and a vague suggestive steaminess. All smells, warm, rich, and varied smells that twined and twisted and wreathed themselves at last into one complete, voluptuous, perfect smell that seemed like the very soul of nature, taking form and appearing to her children, a true goddess, a mother of solace and comfort. Toad now knew that he had not been really hungry before. What he had felt earlier in the day had been a mere trifling qualm. This was the real thing at last, and no mistake. And it would have to be dealt with speedily, too, or there would be trouble for somebody or something. He looked the gypsy over carefully, wondering vaguely whether it would be easier to fight him or cajole him. So there he sat and sniffed and looked at the gypsy, and the gypsy sat and smoked and looked at him. Presently, the gypsy took his pipe out of his mouth and remarked in a careless way, "Want to sell that there horse of yours?" Toad was completely taken aback. He did not know that gypsies were very fond of horse dealing and never missed an opportunity, and he had not reflected that caravans were always on the move and took a great deal of drawing. It had not occurred to him to turn the horse into cash, but the gypsy's suggestion seemed to smooth the way towards the two things he wanted so badly. Real money and a solid breakfast. "What?" he said. "Me sell this beautiful young horse of mine? Oh, no, it's out of the question. Who's going to take the washing home to my customers every week? Besides, I'm too fond of him, and he simply dotes on me." "Try and love a donkey," suggested the gypsy. "Some people do." "You don't seem to see," continued Toad, "that this fine horse of mine is a cut above you altogether. He's a blood horse, he is, partly, not the part you see, of course, another part. And he's been a prize hackney, too, in his time. That was a time before you knew him, but you can still tell it on him in a glance if you understood anything about horses. No, it's not to be thought of for a moment. All the same, how much might you be disposed to offer for this beautiful young horse of mine?" The gypsy looked the horse over, and then he looked Toad over with equal care and looked at the horse again. "Shilling a leg," he said briefly, and turned away, continuing to smoke and try to stare the wide world out of countenance. "A shilling a leg!" cried Toad. "If you please, I must take a little time to work that out and see just what it comes to." He climbed down off his horse and left it to graze and sat down by the gypsy and did sums on his fingers, and at last he said, "Why, that comes to exactly 4 shillings, and no more. Oh, no, I could not think of accepting 4 shillings for this beautiful young horse of mine." "Well," said the gypsy, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make it 5 shillings, and that's 3 and 6 more than that animal's worth, and that's my last word." The Toad sat and pondered long and deeply, for he was hungry and quite penniless, and still some way, he knew not how far, from home, and enemies might still be looking for him. To one in such a situation, 5 shillings may very well appear a large sum of money. On the other hand, it did not seem very much to get for a horse, but then again, the horse hadn't cost him anything, so whatever he got was all clear profit. At last he said firmly, "Look here, gypsy, I tell you what we'll do. Now this is my last word. You shall hand me over 6 shillings and 6 cash down, and further, in addition thereto, you shall give me as much breakfast as I can possibly eat at one sitting, of course, out of that iron pot of yours that keeps sending forth such delicious and exciting smells. In return, I will make over to you my spirited young horse, with all the beautiful harness and trappings that are on him, freely thrown in. If that's not good enough for you, so say, and I'll be getting on. I know a man near to here who's wanted this horse of mine for years." The gypsy grumbled frightfully, and declared if he did a few more deals of that sort, he'd be ruined. But in the end, He lugged a dirty canvas bag out of the depths of his trouser pocket and counted out 6 shillings and 6 pence into Toad's paw. Then he disappeared into the caravan for an instant and returned with a large iron plate and a knife, fork, and spoon. He tilted up the pot, and a glorious stream of hot, rich stew gurgled into the plate. It was indeed the most beautiful stew in the world, being made of partridges and pheasants and chickens and hares and rabbits and peahens and guinea fowls and 1 or 2 other things. Toad took the plate in his lap, almost crying, and stuffed and stuffed and stuffed and kept asking for more, and the gypsy never grudged him. He thought that he had never eaten so good a breakfast in all his life. When Toad had taken as much stew on board as he thought he could possibly hold, he got up and said goodbye to the gypsy and took an affectionate farewell of the horse, and the gypsy, who knew the riverside well, gave him directions which way to go, and he set forth on his travels again in the best possible spirits. He was indeed a very different Toad from the animal of an hour ago. The sun was shining brightly. His wet clothes were quite dry again. He had money in his pocket once more. He was nearing home and friends and safety, and most and best of all, he had a substantial meal, hot and nourishing, and felt big and strong and careless and self-confident. As he tramped along gaily, he thought of his adventures and escapes, and how when things seemed at their worst, he always managed to find a way out. And his pride and conceit began to swell within him. "Ho-ho!" he said to himself as he marched along with his chin in the air. "What a clever Toad I am! There's surely no animal equal to me for cleverness in the whole world. My enemies shut me up in prison, encircled by sentries, watched night and day by warders. I'll walk out through 'em all, my sheer ability coupled with courage. They pursue me with engines and policemen and revolvers. I snap my fingers at 'em and vanish, laughing into space. I am unfortunately thrown into a canal by a woman fat of body and very evil-minded. What of it? I swim ashore, I seize her horse, I ride off in triumph, and I sell the horse for a whole pocket full of money and an excellent breakfast. Oh, I'm the Toad, the handsome, the popular, the successful Toad." He got so puffed up with a conceit that he made up a song as he walked in praise of himself and sang it at the top of his voice, though there was no one to hear it but him. It was perhaps the most conceited song that any animal ever composed. "The world has held great heroes, as history books have showed, but never a name to go down to fame compared with that of Toad. The clever men at Oxford know all that there is to be knowed, but none of 'em know one half as much as intelligent Mr. Toad. The animals sat in the ark and cried, their tears in torrents flowed. Who was it said, 'There's land ahead,' encouraging Mr. Toad? The army all saluted as they marched along the road. Was it the king or Kitchener? No, it was Mr. Toad. The queen and her ladies in waiting sat at the window and sewed. She cried, 'Look, who's that handsome man?' They answered, 'Mr. Toad.'" There was a great deal more of the same sort, but too dreadfully conceited to be written down. These are some of the milder verses. So he sang as he walked, and he walked as he sang, and got more inflated every minute. But his pride was shortly to have a severe fall. After some miles of country lanes, he reached the high road, and as he turned into it and glanced along its white length, he saw approaching him a speck that turned into a dot, and then into a blob, and then into something very familiar, and a double note of warning, only too well known, fell on his delighted ear. "This is real life again, and is once more the great world from which I have been missed so long. I'll hail on my brothers of the wheel and pitch 'em a yarn of the sort that's been so successful hitherto, and they'll give me a lift, of course, and then I'll talk to 'em some more, and perhaps with luck it may even end in my driving up to Toad Hall in a motor car. That'll be one in the eye for Badger." He stepped confidently out into the road to hail the motor car, which came along at an easy pace, slowing down as it neared the lane, when suddenly he became very pale. His heart turned to water, his knees shook and yielded under him, and he doubled up and collapsed with a sickening pain in his interior. And well he might, the unhappy animal, for the approaching car was the very one he had stolen out of the yard of the Red Lion Hotel on that fatal day when all his troubles began. And the people in it were the very same people he sat and watched at luncheon in the coffee room. He sank down in a shabby, miserable heap in the mud, murmuring to himself in his despair, "It's all up. It's all over. Chains and policemen again, prison again, dry bread and water again. Oh, what a fool I've been. What did I want to go strutting about the country for, singing conceited songs and hailing people in broad daylight on the high road, instead of hiding till nightfall and slipping home quietly by back ways? Oh, hapless Toad. Oh, ill-fated animal." The terrible motor car drew slowly nearer and nearer, till at last he heard it stop just short of him. Two gentlemen got out and walked round the trembling heap of crumpled misery lying in the road, and one of them said, "Oh dear, this is very bad. Here's a poor old thing, a washerwoman apparently, who has fainted in the road. Perhaps she's overcome by the heat, poor creature, or possibly she hadn't had any food today. Let us lift her in the car and take her to the nearest village, where doubtless she has friends." They tenderly lifted Toad into the motor car and propped him up with soft cushions and proceeded on their way. When Toad heard them talk in so kind and sympathetic a way, and he knew that he was not recognized, his courage began to revive, and he cautiously opened first one eye and then the other. "Look," said one of the gentlemen, "she's better already. The fresh air's doing her good. How do you feel now, ma'am?" "Thank you kindly, sir," said Toad in a feeble voice. "I'm feeling a great deal better." "That's right," said the gentleman. "Now keep quite still, and above all, don't try to talk." "I won't," said Toad. "I was only thinking if I might sit on the front seat there beside the driver, where I could get the fresh air full in my face, I should soon be all right again." "What a very sensible woman," said the gentleman. "Of course you shall." So they carefully helped Toad into the front seat beside the driver, and on they went again. Toad was almost himself again by now. He sat up, looked around him, and tried to beat down the tremors, the yearnings, the old cravings that rose up and beset him and took possession of him entirely. "It's fate," he said to himself. "Why strive? Why struggle?" And he turned to the driver at his side. "Please, sir," he said, "I wish you would kindly let me try and drive the car for a little. I've been watching you carefully, and it looks so easy and so interesting, and I should like to be able to tell my friends that once I had driven a motor car." The driver laughed at the proposal so heartily that the gentleman inquired what the matter was. When he heard, he said, to Toad's delight, "Bravo, ma'am, I like your spirit. Let her have a try and look after her. She won't do any harm." Toad eagerly scrambled into the seat vacated by the driver, took the steering wheel in his hands, listened with affected humility to the instructions given him, and set the car in motion, but very slowly and carefully at first, for he was determined to be prudent. The gentlemen behind clapped their hands and applauded, and Toad heard them saying, "How well she does it! Fancy a washerwoman driving a car as well as that, the first time!" Toad went a little faster, then faster still, and faster. He heard the gentleman call out warningly, "Be careful, washerwoman," and this annoyed him, and he began to lose his head. The driver tried to interfere, but he pinned him down in his seat with one elbow and put on full speed. The rush of air in his face, the hum of the engines, and the light jump of the car beneath him intoxicated his weak brain. "Washerwoman, indeed!" he shouted recklessly. "Ho-ho! I am the Toad, the motor car snatcher, the prison breaker, the Toad who always escapes. Sit still, and you shall know what driving really is, for you are in the hands of the famous, the skillful, the entirely fearless Toad." With a cry of horror, the whole party rose and flung themselves on him. "Seize him!" they cried. "Seize the Toad, the wicked animal who stole our motor car. Bind him, chain him, drag him to the nearest police station. Down with the desperate and dangerous Toad." Alas, they should have thought, they ought to have been more prudent, they should have remembered to stop the motor car somehow before playing any pranks of that sort. With a half-turn of the wheel, the Toad sent the car crashing through the low hedge that ran along the roadside. One mighty bound, a violent shock, and the wheels of the car were churning up the thick mud of a horse pond. Toad found himself flying through the air with the strong upward rush and delicate curve of a swallow. He liked the motion and was just beginning to wonder whether it would go on till he developed wings and turned into a toad bird when he landed on his back with a thump in the soft, rich grass of a meadow. Sitting up, he could just see the motor car in the pond, nearly submerged. The gentleman and the driver, encumbered by their long coats, were floundering helplessly in the water. He picked himself up rapidly and set off running across country as hard as he could, scrambling through hedges, jumping ditches, pounding across fields, till he was breathless and weary and had to settle down into an easy walk. When he had recovered his breath somewhat and was able to think calmly, he began to giggle, and from giggling he took to laughing, and he laughed till he had to sit down under a hedge. "Ho, ho!" he cried in ecstasies of self-admiration. "Toad again! Toad, as usual, comes out on top. Who was it that got him to give him a lift? Who managed to get on the front seat for the sake of fresh air? Who persuaded them into letting him see if he could drive? Who landed 'em all in a horse pond? Who escaped, flying gaily and unscathed through the air, leaving the narrow-minded, grudging, timid excursionists in the mud where they should rightly be? Why, Toad, of course. Clever Toad. Great Toad. Good Toad." Then he burst into song again, and chanted with uplifted voice, "The motor car went poop, poop, poop as it raced along the road. Who was it steered it into a pond? Ingenious Mr. Toad. Oh, how clever I am! How clever, how clever, how very clever!" A slight noise at a distance behind him made him turn his head and look. Oh, horror! Oh, misery! Oh, despair! About 2 fields off, a chauffeur in his leather gaiters and 2 large rural policemen were visible, running towards him as hard as they could go. Toad sprang to his feet and pelted away again, his heart in his mouth. "Oh, my!" he gasped as he panted along. "What an ass I am! What a conceited and heedless ass! Swaggering again, shouting and singing songs again, sitting still and gassing again. Oh, my! Oh, my! Oh, my!" He glanced back and saw to his dismay that they were gaining on him. On he ran desperately, but kept looking back and saw that they still gained steadily. He did his best, but he was a fat animal, and his legs were short, and still they gained. He could hear them close behind him now, ceasing to heed where he was going. He struggled on blindly and wildly, looking back over his shoulder at the now triumphant enemy, when suddenly the earth failed under his feet. He grasped at the air, and splash! He found himself head over ears in deep water, rapid water, water that bore him along with a force he could not contend with, and he knew that in his blind panic he had run straight into the river. He rose to the surface and tried to grasp the reeds and the rushes that grew along the water's edge close under the bank, but the stream was so strong that it tore them out of his hands. "Oh, my!" gasped poor Toad. "If I ever steal a motor car again, if I ever sing another conceited song—" Then down he went, and came up breathless and spluttering. Presently he saw that he was approaching a big dark hole in the bank just above his head, and as the stream bore him past, he reached up with a paw and caught hold of the edge and held on. Then slowly and with difficulty he drew himself up out of the water, till at last he was able to rest his elbows on the edge of the hole. There he remained for some minutes, puffing and panting, for he was quite exhausted. As he sighed and blew and stared before him into the dark hole, some bright small thing shone and twinkled in its depths, moving towards him. As it approached, a face grew up gradually around it, and it was a familiar face, brown and small with whiskers, grave and round with neat ears and silky hair. It was the water rat. Chapter 11. Like summer tempests came his tears. The rat put out a neat little brown paw, gripped Toad firmly by the scruff of the neck, and gave a great hoist and a pull, and the waterlogged Toad came up slowly but surely over the edge of the hole, till at last he stood safe and sound in the hall, streaked with mud and weed to be sure, and with the water streaming off of him, but happy and high-spirited as of old, now that he found himself once more in the house of a friend, and dodgings and evasions were over, and he could lay aside a disguise that was unworthy of his position and wanted such a lot of living up to. "Oh, Ratty," he cried, "I've been through so much since the time I saw you last, you can't think. Such trials, such sufferings, and all so nobly borne. Then such escapes, such disguises, such subterfuges, and all so cleverly planned and carried out. Been in prison, got out of it, of course. Been thrown into a canal, swam ashore, stole a horse, sold him for a large sum of money, humbugged everybody, made 'em all do exactly what I wanted. Oh, I'm a smart toad, and no mistake. What you think my last exploit was? Just hold on till I tell you. Toad," said the water rat gravely and firmly, "you go off upstairs at once and take off that old cotton rag that looks as if it might formerly have belonged to some washerwoman, and clean yourself thoroughly and put on some of my clothes, and try and come down looking like a gentleman if you can. For a more shabby, bedraggled, disreputable-looking object than you are I never set eyes on in my whole life. Now stop swaggering and arguing and be off. I'll have something to say to you later." Toad was at first inclined to stop and do some talking back at him. He had had enough of being ordered about when he was in prison, and here was the thing being begun all over again, apparently, and by a rat, too. However, he caught sight of himself in the looking-glass over the hat-stand, with the rusty black bonnet perched rakishly over one eye, and he changed his mind and went very quickly and humbly upstairs to the rat's dressing-room. There he had a thorough wash and brush-up, changed his clothes, and stood for a long time before the glass, contemplating himself with pride and pleasure, and thinking what utter idiots all the people must have been to have ever mistaken him for one moment for a washerwoman. By the time he came down again, luncheon was on the table, and very glad Toad was to see it, for he had been through some trying experiences, and had taken much hard exercise since the excellent breakfast provided for him by the gypsy. While they ate, Toad told the rat all his adventures, dwelling chiefly on his own cleverness and presence of mind in emergencies and cunning in tight places, and rather making out that he had been having a gay and high-colored experience. But the more he talked and boasted, the more grave and silent the rat became. When at last Toad had talked himself to a standstill, there was silence for a while, and then the rat said, "Now, Toady, I don't want to give you pain after all you've been through already, but seriously, don't you see what an awful ass you've been making of yourself? On your own admission, you've been handcuffed, imprisoned, starved, chased, terrified out of your life, insulted, jeered at, and ignominiously flung into the water by a woman, too. Where's the amusement in that? Where does the fun come from? And all because you must needs go and steal a motor car. You know that you've never had anything but trouble from motor cars from the moment you first set eyes on one. But if you will be mixed up with them, as you generally are 5 minutes after you've started, why steal them? Be a cripple if you think it's exciting. Be a bankrupt for a change if you've set your mind on it. But why choose to be a convict? When are you going to be sensible and think of your friends and try and be a credit to them? Do you suppose it's any pleasure to me, for instance, to hear animals saying as I go about that I'm the chap that keeps company with jailbirds? Now, it was a very comforting point in Toad's character that he was a thoroughly good-hearted animal and never minded being jawed by those who were his real friends. And even when he most set upon a thing, he was always able to see the other side of the question. So, although the rat was talking so seriously, he kept saying to himself mutinously, "But it was fun, though, awful fun," and making strange, suppressed noises inside him, and poop, and other sounds resembling stifled snorts or the opening of soda-water bottles. Yet when the rat had quite finished, he heaved a deep sigh and said, very nicely and humbly, "Quite right, Ratty. How sound you always are. Yes, I've been a conceited old ass, I can quite see that. And now I'm going to be a good toad, and not do it any more. As for motor cars, I've not been at all so keen about 'em since my last ducking in that river of yours. The fact is, while I was hanging on the edge of your hole and getting my breath, I had a sudden idea, a really brilliant idea, connected with motorboats. There, don't take on so, old chap, and stamp and upset things. It was only an idea. We don't want to talk about it anymore now. We'll have our coffee and a smoke and a quiet chat, and then I'm going to stroll quietly down to Toad Hall and get into clothes of my own and set things going again on the old lines. I've had enough of adventures. I shall lead a quiet, steady, respectable life, puttering about my property and improving it and doing a little landscape gardening at times. There will always be a bit of dinner for my friends when they come to see me, and I shall keep a pony chase to jog about the country in, just as I used to in the old days before I got restless and wanted to do things. Stroll quietly down to Toad Hall, cried the rat, greatly excited. What are you talking about? Do you mean to say you haven't heard? Heard what? Said the toad, turning rather pale. Go on, Ratty, quick, don't spare me. What haven't I heard? Do you mean to tell me, shouted the rat, thumping his little fist on the table, that you've heard nothing about the stoats and weasels? What, the wildwooders? Cried Toad, trembling in every limb. No, not a word. What they've been doing? Now they've been and taken Toad Hall, continued the rat. Toad leaned his elbows on the table and his chin on his paws, and a large tear welled up in each one of his eyes, overflowed and splashed on the table. Plop, plop. Go on, Ratty, he murmured presently. Tell me all. The worst is over. I'm an animal again. I can bear it. When you got into that trouble of yours, said the rat slowly and impressively, I mean, when you disappeared from society for a time over that misunderstanding about a machine, you know. Toad merely nodded. Well, it was a good deal talked about down here, naturally, continued the rat, not only along the riverside, but even in the wild wood. Animals took sides, as always happens. The river bankers stuck up for you and said you'd been infamously treated, and there was no justice to be had in the land nowadays. But the wildwood animals said hard things and served you right, and it was time this sort of thing was stopped. And they got very cocky and went about saying you were done for this time. You would never come back again, never, never. Toad nodded once more, keeping silence. That's the sort of little beasts they are, the rat went on. But Mole and Badger, they struck out through thick and thin that you would be back again somehow. They didn't know exactly how, but somehow. Toad began to sit up in his chair again and smirk a little. They argued from history, continued the rat, that said no criminal laws had ever been known to prevail against cheek and plausibility such as yours, combined with the power of a long purse. So they arranged to move their things into Toad Hall and sleep there and keep it aired and have it ready when you turned up. They didn't guess what was going to happen, of course. Still, they had their suspicions of the wildwood animals. Now, I come to the most painful and tragic part of my story. One dark night, it was very dark, and blowing hard, too, and raining simply cats and dogs, a band of weasels, armed to the teeth, crept silently up the carriage drive to the front entrance. Simultaneously, a body of desperate ferrets, advancing through the kitchen garden, possessed themselves of the backyard and offices, while a company of skirmishing stoats, who stuck at nothing, occupied the conservatory and the billiard room, and held the French windows open and onto the lawn. The Mole and Badger were sitting by the fire in the smoking room, telling stories and suspecting nothing, for it wasn't a night for any animals to be out, when those bloodthirsty villains broke down the doors and rushed in upon them from every side. They made the best fight they could, but what was the good? They were unarmed and taken by surprise, and what can two animals do against hundreds? They took and beat them severely with sticks, those two poor faithful creatures, and turned them out into the cold and wet, with many insulting and uncalled-for remarks. Here the unfeeling Toad broke into a giggle, and then pulled himself together and tried to look particularly solemn. And the wildwooders have been living in Toad Hall ever since, continued the rat, and going on simply anyhow, lying in bed half the day and breakfast at all hours. The place is in such a mess, I'm told, it's not fit to be seen. Eating your grub and drinking your drink and making bad jokes about you and singing vulgar songs about, well, prisons and magistrates and policemen and horrid personal songs with no humor in them, and they're telling the tradespeople and everybody that they've come to stay for good. Oh, they have, said Toad, getting up and seizing a stick. I'll jolly soon see to that. It's no good, Toad, called the rat after him. You'd better come back and sit down. You're only getting into trouble. But the Toad was off, and there was no holding him. He marched rapidly down the road, his stick over his shoulder, fuming and muttering to himself in his anger till he got near his front gate, when suddenly there popped up from behind the palings a long yellow ferret with a gun. "Who comes there?" said the ferret sharply. "Stuff and nonsense," said the toad very angrily. "What do you mean by talking like that to me? Come out of it at once, or out." The ferret never said a word, but he brought his gun up to his shoulder. Toad prudently dropped flat on the road, and bang! A bullet whistled over his head. The startled toad scrambled to his feet and scampered off down the road as hard as he could, and as he ran he heard the ferret laughing, and other horrid thin little laughs taking it up and carrying on the sound. He went back very crestfallen and told the water rat. "What'd I tell you?" said the rat. "It's no good. They got sentries posted, and they're all armed. You must just wait." Still, Toad was not inclined to give in all at once, so he got out the boat and set off rowing up the river to where the garden front of Toad Hall came down to the waterside. Arriving within sight of his old home, he rested on his oars and surveyed the land cautiously. All seemed very peaceful and deserted and quiet. He could see the whole front of Toad Hall glowing in the evening sunshine, the pigeons settling by twos and threes along the straight line of the roof, the garden a blaze of flowers, the creek that led up to the boathouse, the little wooden bridge that crossed it, all tranquil, uninhabited, apparently waiting for his return. He would try the boathouse first, he thought. Very warily he paddled up to the mouth of the creek and was just passing under the bridge when, crash! A great stone dropped from above, smashed through the bottom of the boat. It filled and sank, and Toad found himself struggling in deep water. Looking up, he saw two stoats leaning over the parapet of the bridge and watching him with great glee. "It'll be your head next time, Toady," they called out to him. The indignant Toad swam to shore while the stoats laughed and laughed, supporting each other, and laughed again till they nearly had two fits, that is, one fit each, of course. The Toad retraced his weary way on foot and related his disappointing experiences to the water rat once more. "Well, what did I tell you?" said the rat very crossly. "And now look here. See what you've been and done. Lost me my boat that I was so fond of, that's what you've gone and done, and simply ruined that nice suit of clothes that I lent you. Really, Toad, and of all the trying animals, I wonder you managed to keep any friends at all." The Toad at once saw how wrongly and foolishly he had acted. He admitted his errors and wrong-headedness and made a full apology to Rat for losing his boat and spoiling his clothes. And he wound up by saying, with that frank self-surrender which always disarmed his friends' criticism and won them back to his side, "Ratty, I see that I have been a headstrong and willful Toad. Henceforth, believe me, I'll be humble and submissive, and will take no action without your kind advice and full approval." "If that's really so," said the good-natured rat, already appeased, "then my advice to you is, considering the lateness of the hour, to sit down and have your supper, which will be on the table in a minute, and be very patient, for I'm convinced that we can do nothing until we've seen the mole and badger and heard their latest news and held conference and taken their advice on this difficult matter." "Ah, yes, of course, the mole and the badger," said the Toad lightly. "What's become of them, the dear fellows? I'd forgotten all about them." Well, may you ask," said the rat reproachfully. "While you were riding about the country in expensive motor cars and galloping proudly on blood horses and breakfasting on the fat of the land, those two poor devoted animals have been camping out in the open in every sort of weather, living very rough by day and lying very hard by night, watching over your house, patrolling your boundaries, keeping a constant eye on the stoats and the weasels, scheming and planning and contriving how to get your property back for you. You don't deserve to have such true and loyal friends, Toad. You don't, really. Some day, when it's too late, you'll be sorry you didn't value 'em more while you had 'em." "I'm an ungrateful beast, I know," sobbed Toad, shedding bitter tears. "Let me go out and find 'em out into the cold, dark night and share their hardships and try and prove by— Hold on a bit. Surely I've heard a chink of dishes on a tray. Supper's here at last. Hooray! Come on, Ratty." The rat remembered that poor Toad had been on prison fare for a considerable time, and that large allowances had therefore to be made. He followed him to the table accordingly, and hospitably encouraged him in his gallant effort to make up for past privations. They had just finished their meal and resumed their armchairs when there came a heavy knock at the door. Toad was nervous, but the rat, nodding mysteriously at him, went straight up to the door and opened it, and in walked Mr. Badger. He had all the appearance of one who for some nights had been kept away from home and all its little comforts and conveniences. His shoes were covered with mud, and he was looking very rough and tousled. But then he had never been a very smart man, the Badger, at the best of times. He came solemnly up to Toad, shook him by the paw, and said, "Welcome home, Toad. Alas, what am I saying? Home indeed. This is a poor homecoming, unhappy Toad." Then he turned his back on him, sat down to the table, drew his chair up, and helped himself to a large slice of cold pie. Toad was quite alarmed at this very serious and portentous style of greeting, but the rat whispered to him, "Never mind. Don't take any notice, and don't say anything to him just yet. He's always rather low and despondent when he's wanting his victuals. In half an hour's time, he'll be quite a different animal." So they waited in silence, and presently there came another and a lighter knock. The rat, with a nod to Toad, went to the door and ushered in the mole, very shabby and unwashed, with bits of hay and straw sticking in his fur. "Hooray! Here's old Toad!" cried the mole, his face beaming. "Fancy having you back again!" And he began to dance round him. "We never dreamt you would turn up so soon. Why, you must have managed to escape, you clever, ingenious, intelligent Toad." The rat, alarmed, pulled him by the elbow, but it was too late. Toad was puffing and swelling already. "Clever? Oh, no," he said. "I'm not really clever, according to my friends. I've only broken out of the strongest prison in England, that's all, and captured a railway train and escaped on it, that's all, and disguised myself and gone about the country humbugging everybody. That's all. And no, I'm a stupid ass, I am. I'll tell you one or two of my little adventures, Mole, and you shall judge for yourself." "Well, well," said the mole, moving towards the supper table. "Supposing you talk while I eat. Not a bite since breakfast. Oh, my, oh, my." And he sat down and helped himself liberally to cold beef and pickles. Toad straddled on the hearth rug, thrust his paw into his trouser pocket, and pulled out a handful of silver. "Look at that," he cried, displaying it. "That's not so bad, is it, for a few minutes' work? And how do you think I done it, Mole? Horse dealing, that's how I done it." "Go on, Toad," said the mole, immensely interested. "Toad, do be quiet, please," said the rat. "And don't you egg him on, Mole, when you know what he is. But please tell us as soon as possible what the position is and what's best to be done now that Toad's back at last." "The position's about as bad as it can be," replied the mole grumpily. "And as for what's to be done, why, blest if I know. The Badger and I have been round and round the place by night and day, always the same thing. Sentries posted everywhere, guns poked out at us, stones thrown at us, always an animal on the lookout, and when they see us, my, how they laugh. That's what annoys me the most." "It's a very difficult situation," said the rat, reflecting deeply, "but I think I see now, in the depths of my mind, what Toad really ought to do. I'll tell you. He ought to—" "No, he oughtn't," shouted the mole with his mouth full. "Nothing of the sort. You don't understand. What he ought to do is, he ought to—" "Well, I shan't do it anyway," cried the Toad, getting excited, "and I'm not going to be ordered about by you fellas. It's my house we're talking about, and I know exactly what I'll do. And I'll tell you, I'm going to—" By this time, they were all three talking at once at the top of their voices, and the noise was simply deafening, when a thin, dry voice made itself heard, saying, "Be quiet at once, all of you." And instantly everyone was silent. It was the Badger, who, having finished his pie, had turned round in his chair and was looking at them severely. When he saw that he had secured their attention and that they were evidently waiting for him to address them, he turned back to the table again and reached out for the cheese. And so great was the respect commanded by the solid qualities of the admirable animal that not another word was uttered until he had quite finished his repast and brushed the crumbs from his knees. The Toad fidgeted a good deal, but the rat held him firmly down. When the Badger had quite done, he got up from his seat and stood before the fireplace, reflecting deeply. At last he spoke. "Toad," he said severely, "you bad, troublesome little animal, aren't you ashamed of yourself? What do you think your father, my old friend, would have said if he had been here tonight and had known of all your goings-on? Toad, who was on the sofa by this time with his legs up, rolled over on his face, shaken by sobs of contrition. "There, there," went on the Badger more kindly. "Now, never mind. Stop crying. We're going to let bygones be bygones and try and turn over a new leaf. But what the mole says is quite true. The stoats are on guard at every point, and they make the best sentinels in the world. It's quite useless to think of attacking the place. They're too strong for us." "Then it's all over," sobbed the Toad, crying into the sofa cushions. "I shall go and enlist for a soldier and never see my dear Toad Hall no more." "Come on, cheer up, Toady," said the Badger. "There are more ways of getting back a place than taking it by storm. I hadn't said my last word yet. Now I'm going to tell you a great secret." Toad sat up slowly and dried his eyes. Secrets had an immense attraction for him because he could never keep one, and he enjoyed the sort of unhallowed thrill he experienced when he went and told another animal after having faithfully promised not to. "There is an underground passage," said the Badger impressively, "that leads from the riverbank, quite near here, right up into the middle of Toad Hall." "Oh, nonsense, Badger," said Toad, rather airily. "You've been listening to some of the yarns they spin in the public houses about here. I know every inch of Toad Hall inside and out. Nothing of the sort, I do assure you." "My young friend," said the Badger with great severity, "your father was a worthy animal, a lot worthier than some others I know. Was a particular friend of mine, and told me a great deal he wouldn't have dreamt of telling you. He discovered that passage. He didn't make it, of course. That was done hundreds of years before he ever came to live there. And he repaired it and cleaned it out because he thought it might come in useful some day, in case of trouble or danger. And he showed it to me. 'Don't let my son know about it,' he said. 'He's a good boy, but very light and volatile in character, and simply cannot hold his tongue. If he's ever in a real fix, and it would be of use to him, you may tell him about the secret passage, but not before.' The other animals looked hard at Toad to see how he would take it. Toad was inclined to be sulky at first, but he brightened up immediately, like the good fellow he was. "Well, well," he said, "perhaps I am a bit of a talker, a popular fellow such as I am. My friends get round me, we chaff, we sparkle, we tell witty stories, and somehow my tongue gets wagging. I have the gift of conversation. I've been told I ought to have a salon, whatever that may be. Never mind. Go on, Badger. How's this passage of yours going to help us?" "I've found a thing or two lately," continued the Badger. "I got Otter to disguise himself as a sweep and call at the back door with brushes over his shoulder asking for a job. There's going to be a big banquet tomorrow night. It's somebody's birthday, the Chief Weasel's, I believe. And all the weasels will be gathered together in the dining hall, eating and drinking and laughing and carrying on, suspecting nothing. No guns, no swords, no sticks, no arms of any sort whatever." "But the sentinels will be posted as usual," remarked the Rat. "Exactly," said the Badger. "That's my point. The weasels will trust entirely to their excellent sentinels. That's where the passage comes in. That very useful tunnel leads right up under the butler's pantry next to the dining hall." The squeaky board in the butler's pantry," said the Toad. "And now I understand it." "We shall creep out quietly into the butler's pantry," cried the Mole. "With our pistols and swords and sticks," shouted the Rat. "And rush in upon 'em," said the Badger. "And whack 'em, whack 'em, whack 'em, whack 'em, whack 'em," cried the Toad in ecstasy, running around and round the room and jumping over chairs. "Very well, then," said the Badger, resuming his usual dry manner. "Our plan is settled, and there's nothing more for you to argue and squabble about. So as it's getting very late, all of you go right off to bed at once. We'll make all the necessary arrangements in the course of the morning tomorrow." Toad, of course, went off to bed dutifully with the rest. He knew better than to refuse, though he was feeling much too excited to sleep. But he had had a long day, with many events crowded into it, and sheets and blankets were very friendly and comforting things after plain straw, and not too much of it, spread on the stone floor of a draughty cell, and his head had not been there many seconds on his pillow before he was snoring happily. Naturally, he dreamt a good deal about roads that ran away from him just when he wanted them, and canals that chased him and caught him, and a barge that sailed into the banqueting hall with his week's washing just as he was giving a dinner party, and he was all alone in the secret passage, pushing onwards, but it twisted and turned round and shook itself and sat up on its end, yet somehow at the last he found himself back in Toad Hall, safe and triumphant, with all his friends gathered round about him, earnestly assuring him that he really was a clever toad. He slept till a late hour next morning, and by the time he got down, he found that the other animals had finished their breakfast some time before. The mole had slipped off somewhere by himself without telling anyone where he was going. The badger sat in the armchair reading the paper and not concerning himself in the slightest about what was going to happen that very evening. The rat, on the other hand, was running around the room busily with his arms full of weapons of every kind, distributing them in 4 little heaps on the floor and saying excitedly under his breath as he ran, "Here's a sword for rat, here's a sword for mole, here's a sword for the toad, here's a sword for the badger, here's a pistol for the rat, here's a pistol for the mole, here's a pistol for the toad, here's a pistol for the badger," and so on in a regular, rhythmical way, while the 4 little heaps gradually grew and grew. "That's all very well, rat," said the badger, presently, looking at the busy little animal over the edge of the newspaper. "I'm not blaming you, but just let us once get past the stoats with those detestable guns of theirs, and I assure you we shan't want any swords or pistols. We 4 with our sticks, once we're inside the dining hall, why, we'll clear the floor of the lot of 'em in 5 minutes. I'd have done the whole thing by myself, only I didn't want to deprive you fellows of the fun." "It's as well to be on the safe side," said the rat reflectively, polishing a pistol barrel on his sleeve and looking along it. The toad, having finished his breakfast, picked up a stout stick and swung it vigorously, belaboring imaginary animals. "I'll learn 'em to steal my house," he cried. "I'll learn 'em! I'll learn 'em!" "Don't say learn 'em, Toad," said the rat, greatly shocked. "It's not good English." "What are you always nagging at Toad for?" inquired the badger, rather peevishly. "What's the matter with his English? It's the same as what I use, and if it's good enough for me, it ought to be good enough for you." "I'm very sorry," said the rat humbly, "only I think it ought to be teach them, not learn them." "But we don't want to teach 'em," replied the badger. "We want to learn 'em. Learn 'em, learn 'em, learn 'em, and what's more, we're going to do it, too." "Oh, very well, have it your way," said the rat. He was getting rather muddled about it himself, and presently he retired into a corner where he could be heard muttering, "Learn 'em, teach 'em, learn 'em," till the badger told him rather sharply to leave it off. Presently the mole came tumbling into the room, evidently very pleased with himself. "I've been having such fun," he began at once. "I've been getting a rise out of the stoats." "I hope you've been very careful, Mole," said the rat anxiously. "I should hope so, too," said the mole confidently. "I got the idea when I went into the kitchen to see about Toad's breakfast being kept hot for him. I found that old washerwoman dress that he came home in yesterday hanging on the towel horse before the fire, so I put it on, and the bonnet as well, and the shawl, and off I went to Toad Hall as bold as you please. The sentries were on the lookout, of course, with their guns and their 'who goes there' and all that rest sort of nonsense. 'Why, good morning, gentlemen,' says I, very respectful. 'Want any washing done today?' They looked at me very proud and stiff and haughty and said, 'Go away, washing woman, we don't do any washing on duty.' 'Or any other time,' says I. 'Ho, ho, ho, wasn't I funny, Toad?'" "Poor frivolous animal," said the toad very loftily. The fact is, he felt exceedingly jealous of Mole for what he had just done. It was exactly what he would have liked to have done himself if only he had thought of it first and hadn't gone and overslept himself. "Some of the stoats turned quite pink," continued the mole, "and the sergeant in charge, he said to me very short, he said, 'Now run away, my good woman, run away. Don't keep my men idling and talking on their posts.' 'Run away?' says I. 'It won't be me that'll be running away in a very short time now.'" "Oh, moly, how could you?" said the rat, dismayed. The badger laid down his paper. "I could see 'em pricking up their ears and looking at each other," went on the mole. "Never mind her. She don't know what she's talking about." "Oh, don't I?" said I. "Well, let me tell you this. My daughter, she washes for Mr. Badger, and that'll show you whether I know what I'm talking about, and you'll know pretty soon, too. 100 bloodthirsty badgers armed with rifles are going to attack Toad Hall this very night by way of the paddock. 6 boatloads of rats with pistols and cutlasses will come up by the river and effect a landing in the garden, while a picked body of toads known as the diehards, or the death or glory toads, will storm the orchard and carry everything before 'em, yelling for vengeance. There won't be much left of you to wash by the time they've done with you unless you clear out while you have the chance.' Then I ran away. And when I was out of sight, I hid, and presently I came creeping back along the ditch and took a peep at 'em through the hedge. They was all nervous and flustered as they could be, running all ways at once and falling all over each other, and everyone giving orders to everybody else and not listening, and the sergeant kept sending off parties of stoats to distant parts of the grounds and then sending other fellows to fetch 'em back again, and I heard 'em saying to each other, 'That's just like the weasels. They're to stop comfortably in the banqueting hall and have feasting and toasts and songs and all sorts of fun, while we must stay on guard in the cold and the dark, and in the end be cut to pieces by bloodthirsty badgers.'" "Oh, you silly ass, Mole!" cried Toad. "You've been and spoilt everything." "Mole," said the Badger in his dry, quiet way, "I perceive you have more sense in your little finger than some other animals have in the whole of their fat bodies. You've managed excellently, and I begin to have great hopes of you. Good Mole, clever Mole." The Toad was simply wild with jealousy, more especially as he couldn't make out for the life of him what the Mole had done that was so particularly clever. But fortunately for him, before he could show temper or expose himself to the Badger's sarcasm, a bell rang for luncheon. It was a simple but sustaining meal, bacon and broad beans and a macaroni pudding. And when they had quite done, the Badger settled himself into an armchair and said, "Well, we've got our work cut out for us tonight. It'll probably be pretty late before we're quite through with it, so I'm just going to take 40 winks while I can." And he drew a handkerchief over his face and was soon snoring. The anxious and laborious Rat at once resumed his preparations and started running between his 4 little heaps, muttering, "Here's a belt for Rat, here's a belt for the Mole, here's a belt for the Toad, here's a belt for the Badger," and so on, with every fresh accoutrement he produced, to which there seemed really no end. So the Mole drew his arm through Toad's, led him out into the open air, shoved him into a wicker chair, and made him tell all his adventures from beginning to end, which Toad was only too willing to do. The Mole was a good listener, and Toad, with no one to check his statements or to criticize in an unfriendly spirit, rather let himself go. Indeed, much that he related belonged more properly to the category of what might have happened had I only thought of it in time instead of 10 minutes afterwards. Those are always the best and the raciest adventures, and why should they not be truly ours as much as the somewhat inadequate things that really come off? Chapter 12. The Return of Ulysses. When it began to grow dark, the Rat, with an air of excitement and mystery, summoned them back into the parlor, stood each of them up alongside of his little heap, and proceeded to dress them up for the coming expedition. He was very earnest and thoroughgoing about it, and the affair took quite a long time. First there was a belt to go round each animal, and then a sword to be stuck into each belt, and then a cutlass on the other side to balance it. Then a pair of pistols, a policeman's truncheon, several sets of handcuffs, some bandages and sticking plaster, and a flask and a sandwich case. The Badger laughed good-humoredly and said, "All right, Ratty, it amuses you and doesn't hurt me. I'm going to do all I've got to do with this here stick." But the Rat only said, "Please, Badger, you know I shouldn't like you to blame me afterwards and say I'd forgotten anything." When all was quite ready, the Badger took a dark lantern in one paw, grasped his great stick with the other, and said, "Now then, follow me. Mole first, 'cause I'm very pleased with him. Rat next, Toad last. And look here, Toady, don't you chatter so much as usual, or you'll be sent back as sure as fate." The Toad was so anxious not to be left out that he took up the inferior position assigned to him without a murmur, and the animals set off. The Badger led them along the river for a little way, and then suddenly swung himself over the edge into a hole in the river bank, a little above the water. The Mole and the Rat followed silently, swinging themselves successfully into the hole as they had seen the Badger do. But when it came to Toad's turn, of course he managed to slip and fall into the water with a loud splash and a squeal of alarm. He was hauled out by his friends, rubbed down, and wrung out hastily, comforted, and set on his legs. But the Badger was seriously angry, and told him that the very next time he made a fool out of himself, he would most certainly be left behind. So, at last, they were in the secret passage, and the cutting-out expedition had really begun. It was cold and dark and damp and low and narrow, and poor Toad began to shiver, partly from dread of what might be before him, partly because he was wet through and through. The lantern was far ahead, and he could not help lagging behind a little in the darkness. Then he heard the rat call out warningly, "Come on, Toad!" And a terror seized him of being left behind, alone in the darkness, and he came on with such a rush that he upset the rat into the mole and the mole into the badger, and for a moment all was confusion. The badger thought that they were being attacked from behind, and as there was no room to use the stick or a cutlass, drew a pistol and was on the point of putting a bullet into Toad. When he found out what had really happened, he was very angry indeed, and said, "Now this time that tiresome Toad shall be left behind." So Toad whimpered, and the other two promised that they would be answerable for his good conduct, and at last Badger was pacified, and the procession moved on, only this time the rat brought up the rear with a firm grip on the shoulder of Toad. So they groped and shuffled along, with their ears pricked up and their paws on their pistols, till at last the Badger said, "We ought to be pretty nearly under the hall." Then suddenly they heard, far away as it might be, and yet apparently nearly over their heads, a confused murmur of sound, as if people were shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor and hammering on tables. The Toad's nervous terrors all returned, but the Badger only remarked placidly, "They are going it, the weasels." The passage now began to slope upwards. They groped onward a little further, and then the noise broke out again, quite distinct this time, and very close above them. "Hooray, hooray, hooray!" they heard, and the stamping of little feet on the floor and the clinking of glasses as little fists pounded on the table. "What a time they're having," said the Badger. "Come on." They hurried along the passage till it came to a full stop, and they found themselves standing under the trap door that led up into the butler's pantry. Such a tremendous noise was going on in the banqueting hall that there was very little danger of their being overheard. The Badger said, "Now, boys, all together," and the four of them put their shoulders to the trap door and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry, with only a door between them and the banqueting hall where their unconscious enemies were carousing. The noise, as they emerged from the passage, was simply deafening. At last, as the cheering and hammering slowly subsided, a voice could be made out saying, "Well, I do not propose to detain you much longer." Great applause. "But before I resume my seat," renewed cheering, "I should like to say a word about our kind host, Mr. Toad. We all know Toad." Great laughter. "Good Toad. Modest Toad. Honest Toad." Shrieks of merriment. "Only just let me get at him," muttered Toad, grinding his teeth. "Hold hard a minute," said the Badger, restraining him with difficulty. "Get ready, all of you." "Let me sing you a little song," went on the voice, "which I've composed on the subject of Toad." Prolonged applause. Then the Chief Weasel, for it was he, began in a high, squeaky voice. "Toad, he went a-pleasuring gaily down the street." The Badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick with both paws, glanced round at his comrades, and cried, "The hour has come, follow me!" and flung the door open wide. My, what a squealing and a squeaking and a screeching filled the air! Well might the terrified weasels dive under the tables and spring madly up at the windows. Well might the ferrets rush wildly for the fireplace and get hopelessly jammed in the chimney. Well might tables and chairs be upset and glass and china be sent crashing to the floor in panic of that terrible moment when the four heroes strode wrathfully into the room. The mighty Badger, his whiskers bristling, his great cudgel whistling through the air, Mole, black and grim, brandishing his stick and shouting his awful war cry, "A mole! A mole!" Rat, desperate and determined, his belt bulging with weapons of every age and every variety, Toad, frenzied with excitement and injured pride, swollen to twice his ordinary size, leaping into the air and emitting toad whoops that chilled them to the marrow. "Toad, he went a-pleasuring," he yelled. "I'll pleasure him," and he went straight for the Chief Weasel. They were but four in all, but the panic-stricken weasels and hall seemed full of monstrous animals, gray, black, brown, and yellow, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels, and they broke and fled with squeals of terror and dismay, this way and that, through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of reach of those terrible sticks. The affair was soon over. Up and down the whole length of the hall strode the four friends, whacking with their sticks at every head that showed itself, and in 5 minutes the room was cleared. Through the broken windows, the shrieks of terrified weasels escaping across the lawn were borne faintly to their ears. On the floor lay prostrate some dozen or so of the enemy, on whom the mole was busily engaged in fitting handcuffs. The badger, resting from his labors, leaned on his stick and wiped his honest brow. "Mole," he said, "you're the best of fellows. Just cut along outside and look after those stoat sentries of yours and see what they're up to. I've an idea that, thanks to you, we shan't have much trouble from 'em tonight." The mole vanished promptly through a window, and the badger bade the other two set at a table on his legs again, pick up knives and forks and plates and glasses from the debris on the floor, and see if they could find materials for a supper. "I want some grub, I do," he said, in that rather common way he had of speaking. "Stir your stumps, Toad, and look lively. We've got your house back for you, and you don't offer us so much as a sandwich." Toad felt rather hurt that the badger didn't say pleasant things to him after he had to the mole and tell him what a fine fellow he was, and how splendidly he had fought, for he was rather particularly pleased with himself in the way he had gone for the chief weasel and sent him flying across the table with one blow of his stick. But he bustled about, and so did the rat, and soon they found some guava jelly in a glass dish, and a cold chicken, a tongue that had hardly been touched, some trifle, and quite a lot of lobster salad. And in the pantry they came upon a basket full of French rolls and any quantity of cheese, butter, and celery. They were just about to sit down when the mole clambered in through the window, chuckling, with an armful of rifles. "It's all over," he reported. "From what I can make out, as soon as the stoats, who were very nervous and jumpy already, heard the shrieks and yells and the uproar inside the hall, some of 'em threw down their rifles and fled. The others stood fast for a bit, but when the weasels came out rushing upon them, they thought they were betrayed, and the stoats grappled with the weasels, and the weasels fought to get away, and they wrestled and wriggled and punched each other and rolled over and over and over till most of them rolled into the river. They've all disappeared by now, one way or another, and I've got their rifles, so that's all right." "Excellent and deserving animal. One more thing I want you to do, Mole, before you sit down to your supper along us. I wouldn't trouble you, only I know I can trust you to see a thing done, and I wish I could say the same for every one of you. I'd send Rat if he wasn't a poet. I want you to take those fellows on the floor there upstairs with you and have some bedrooms cleaned out and tidied up and made real comfortable. See that they sweep under the beds and put clean sheets and pillowcases on, and turn down one corner of the bedclothes, just as it ought to be done, and have a can of hot water and clean towels and fresh cakes of soap put in each room. Then you can give 'em a licking apiece, if that's any satisfaction to you, and put 'em out by the back door, and we shan't see any more of 'em, I fancy. And then come along and have some of this cold tongue. It's first rate. I'm very pleased with you, Mole." The good-natured Mole picked up a stick, formed his prisoners up in a line on the floor, and gave them the order, "Quick march," and led his squad off to the upper floor. After a time he appeared again, smiling, and said that every room was ready and as clean as a new pin. "And I didn't have to lick 'em either," he added. "And I thought, on the whole, that they had enough licking for one night, and the weasels, when I put the point to 'em, quite agreed with me, and they wouldn't think of troubling me. They were very penitent, and said they were extremely sorry for what they'd done, but it was all the fault of the chief weasel and the stoats, and if they could ever do anything for us at any time to make it up, we only had to mention it. So I gave 'em a roll apiece and let 'em out by the back, and off they ran as fast and hard as they could." Then the mole pulled his chair up to the table and pitched into the cold tongue, and Toad, like the gentleman he was, put all of his jealousy from him and said heartily, "Thank you kindly, dear Mole, for all your pains and trouble tonight, and especially for your cleverness this morning." The badger was pleased at that, and said, "There spoke my brave Toad." So they finished their supper in great joy and contentment, and presently retired to rest between clean sheets, safe in Toad's ancestral home, won back by matchless valor, consummate strategy, and a proper handling of sticks. The following morning, Toad, who had overslept himself as usual, came down to breakfast disgracefully late, and found on the table a certain quantity of eggshells, some fragments of cold and leathery toast, a coffee pot 3/4 empty, and really very little else, which did not tend to improve his temper, considering that, after all, it was his own house, Through the French windows of the breakfast room, he could see the mole and the water rat sitting in wicker chairs out on the lawn, evidently telling each other stories, roaring with laughter and kicking their short legs up in the air. The badger, who was in an armchair and deep in the morning paper, merely looked up and nodded when Toad entered the room. But Toad knew his man, so he sat down and made the best breakfast he could, merely observing to himself that he would get square with the others sooner or later. When he had nearly finished, the badger looked up and remarked rather shortly, "I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. You see, we really ought to have this banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you. In fact, it's the rule." "Oh, all right," said the Toad readily. "Anything to oblige. Though why on earth should you want to have a banquet in the morning, I can't understand you. But you know I don't live to please myself, but merely to find out what my friends want, and then try and arrange it for 'em, you dear old badger." "Don't pretend to be stupider than you really are," replied the badger crossly, "and don't chuckle and splutter in your coffee while you're talking. It's not manners. What I mean is, the banquet will be at night, of course, but the invitations will have to be written and got off at once, and you've got to write 'em. Now sit down at the table. There's stacks of letter paper on it, with Toad Hall at the top in blue and gold, and write invitations to all our friends, and if you stick to it, we'll get 'em out before luncheon, and I'll bear a hand, too, and take my share of the burden. I'll order the banquet." "What?" cried Toad, dismayed. "Me stop indoors and write a lot of rotten letters on a jolly morning like this, when I want to go around on my property and set everything and everybody to rights and swagger about and enjoy myself? Certainly not. I'll see you—" "Stop a minute, though. Why, of course, dear badger. What's my pleasure or convenience compared with that of others? You wish it done, it shall be done. Go, badger. Order the banquet. Order what you like. Then join our young friends outside in their innocent mirth, oblivious of me and my cares and toils. I sacrifice this fair morning on the altar of duty and friendship." The badger looked at him very suspiciously, but Toad's frank, open countenance made it difficult to suggest any unworthy motive in this change of attitude. He quitted the room accordingly in the direction of the kitchen, and as soon as the door had closed behind him, Toad hurried to the writing table. A fine idea had occurred to him while he was talking. He would write out the invitations, and he would take care to mention the leading part he had taken in the fight, and how he had laid the chief weasel flat. Then he would hint at his adventures and what a career of triumph he had to tell about, and on that flyleaf he would set out a sort of a program of entertainment for the evening, something like this as he sketched it out in his head. Speech by Toad. There would be other speeches by Toad during the evening. Address by Toad. Synopsis. Our prison system. The waterways of old England. Horse dealing and how to deal. Property. Its rights and its duties. Back to the land. A typical English squire. Song by Toad. Composed by himself. Other compositions by Toad will be sung in the course of the evening by the composer. The idea pleased him mightily, and he worked very hard and got all the letters finished by noon, at which hour it was reported to him that there was a small and rather bedraggled weasel at the door, inquiring timidly whether he could be of any service to the gentleman. Toad swaggered out and found it was one of the prisoners of the previous evening, very respectful and anxious to please. He patted him on the head, shoved the bundle of invitations into his paw, and told him to cut along quick and deliver them as fast as he could, and if he liked to come back again in the evening, perhaps there might be a shilling for him, or again, perhaps there mightn't. And the poor weasel seemed really quite grateful, and hurried off eagerly to do his mission. When the other animals came back to luncheon, very boisterous and breezy after a morning on the river, the mole, whose conscience had been pricking him, looked doubtfully at Toad, expecting to find him sulky or depressed. Instead, he was so uppish and inflated that the mole began to suspect something, while the rat and the badger exchanged significant glances. As soon as the meal was over, Toad thrust his paws deep into his trouser pockets, remarked casually, "Well, look after yourselves, you fellas. Ask for anything you want," and was swaggering off in the direction of the garden, where he wanted to think out an idea or two for his coming speeches, when the rat caught him by the arm. Toad rather suspected what he was after, and did his best to get away. But when the badger took him firmly by the other arm, he began to see that the game was up. The two animals conducted him between them into the small smoking room that opened out into the entrance hall, shut the door, and put him in a chair. Then they both stood in front of him, while Toad sat silent and regarded them with much suspicion and ill humor. "Now look here, Toad," said the rat. "It's about this banquet, and I'm very sorry to have to speak to you like this, but we want you to understand clearly, once and for all, that there are going to be no speeches and no songs. Try and grasp the fact that on this occasion we're not arguing with you. We're just telling you." Toad saw that he was trapped. They understood him. They saw through him. They had got ahead of him. His pleasant dream was shattered. "Mayn't I sing just one little song?" he pleaded piteously. "No, not one little song," replied the rat firmly, though his heart bled as he noticed the trembling lip of the poor disappointed Toad. "It's no good, Toady. You know well that your songs are all conceit and boasting and vanity, and your speeches are all self-praise and, well, gross exaggeration and gas," put in the Badger in his common way. "It's for your own good, Toady," said the rat. "You know you must turn over a new leaf sooner or later, and now seems a splendid time to begin, a sort of turning point in your career. Please don't think that saying all this doesn't hurt me more than it hurts you." The Toad remained a long while plunged in thought. At last he raised his head, and the traces of strong emotion were visible on his features. "You've conquered, my friends," he said in broken accents. "It was, to be sure, but a small thing that I asked, merely leave to blossom and expand for yet one more evening, to let myself go and hear the tumultuous applause that always seemed to me, somehow, to bring out my best qualities. However, you're right, I know, and I'm wrong. Henceforth, I will be a different Toad. My friends, you shall never have occasion to blush from me again. But, oh dear, dear, this is a hard world." And pressing his handkerchief to his face, he left the room with faltering steps. "Badger," said the rat, "I feel like a brute. I wonder what you feel like." "Oh, I know," said the Badger gloomily, "but the thing had to be done. This good fellow has got to live here and hold his own and be respected. Would you have him a common laughing-stock, mocked and jeered at by stoats and weasels?" "Of course not," said the rat. "And talking of weasels, it's lucky we came upon that little weasel just as he was setting out with Toad's invitations. I suspected something from what you told me and had a look at one or two. They were simply disgraceful. I confiscated the lot, and the good mole is now sitting in the blue boudoir filling up plain, simple invitation cards." At last the hour for the banquet began to draw near, and Toad, who on leaving the others had retired to his bedroom, was still sitting there, melancholy and thoughtful, his brow resting on his paw. He pondered long and deeply. Gradually his countenance cleared, and he began to smile long, slow smiles. Then he took to giggling in a shy, self-conscious manner. At last he got up, locked the door, drew the curtains across the windows, collected all the chairs in the room, and arranged them in a semicircle, and took up his position in front of him, swelling visibly. Then he bowed, coughed twice, and, letting himself go with uplifted voice, he sang to the enraptured audience that his imagination so clearly saw. Toad's last little song. The Toad came home. There was panic in the parlors and howling in the halls. There was crying in the cowsheds and shrieking in the stalls when the Toad came home. When the Toad came home, there was smashing in of window and crashing of the door. There was chivying of weasels that fainted on the floor when the Toad came home. Bang go the drums, the trumpeters are tooting, and the soldiers are saluting, and the cannon they are shooting, and the motor cars are hooting, and the hero comes. Shout hooray, and let each one of the crowd try and shout it very loud, in honor of an animal of whom you're justly proud, for it's Toad's great day. He sang this very loud, with great unction and expression, and when he had done, he sang it all over again. Then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh. Then he dipped his hairbrush in the water jug, parted his hair in the middle, and plastered it down very straight and sleek on each side of his face, and unlocking the door, went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests, who he knew must be assembling in the drawing-room. All the animals cheered when he entered, and crowded round to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting abilities. But Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Not at all," or sometimes, for a change, "On the contrary." Otter, who was standing on the hearthrug, describing to an admiring circle of friends exactly how he would have managed things had he been there, came forward with a shout, threw his arm around Toad's neck, and tried to take him round the room in triumphal progress. But Toad, in a mild way, was rather snubby to him, remarking gently as he disengaged himself, "Badger's the mastermind, and Mole and the Water Rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks and did little or nothing." The animals were evidently puzzled and taken aback by this unexpected attitude of his, and Toad felt, as he moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, that he was an object of absorbing interest to every one. The Badger had ordered everything of the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking and laughter and chaff among the animals, but through it all Toad, who of course was in the chair, looked down his nose and murmured pleasant things to the animals on either side of him. At intervals he stole a glance at the Badger and the Rat, and always, when he looked, they were staring at each other with their mouths open, and this gave him the greatest satisfaction. Some of the younger and livelier animals, as the evening wore on, got whispering to each other that things were not so amusing as they used to be in the good old days, and there was some knocking on the table and cries of, "Toad, speech, speech from Toad, song, Mr. Toad's song." But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw in mild protest, and by pressing delicacies on his guests by topical small talk, and by earnest inquiries after members of their families not yet old enough to appear at social functions, managed to convey to them that this dinner was being run on strictly conventional lines. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this climax, the four animals continued to lead their lives, so rudely broken in upon by civil war, in great joy and contentment, undisturbed by further risings or invasions. Toad, after due consultation with his friends, selected a handsome gold chain and locket set with pearls, which he dispatched to the jailer's daughter with a letter that even the Badger admitted to be modest, grateful, and appreciative, and the engine driver, in his turn, was properly thanked and compensated for all his pains and trouble. Under severe compulsion from the Badger, even the barge woman was, with some trouble, sought out, and the value of her horse discreetly made good to her, though Toad kicked terribly at this, holding himself to be an instrument of fate, set to punish fat women with mottled arms who couldn't tell a real gentleman when they saw one. The amount involved, it was true, was not very burdensome, the gypsy's valuation being admitted by local assessors to be approximately correct. Sometimes, in the course of long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wild wood, now successfully tamed so far as they were concerned, and it was pleasing to see how respectfully they were greeted by the inhabitants, and how the mother weasels would bring their young ones out to the mouth of their holes and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and that's the gallant Water Rat, a terrible fighter, walking alongside him. And yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole, of whom you so often heard your father tell about." But when their infants were fractious and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling how, if they didn't hush them and not fret them, the terrible gray Badger would up and get them. That was a base libel on Badger, who, though he cared little about society, was rather fond of children, but it never failed to have its full effect. The end.